I've been asked to give a very accessible talk, so my choice is to proceed in two parts. So in the first part I shall give definitions and properties of tensors, and then in the second part I shall overview some applications related to data science. So first, what are we talking about? A tensor is a multilinear map from a product of vector spaces onto another one. And we say that we have a tensor of order D if we have D vector spaces involved. Once the bases of these vector spaces are fixed, you can represent such maps by arrays of coordinates with D indices. For instance, matrices are arrays with two indices, so they can represent linear maps or bilinear forms. So let's skip this. So a bilinear form is represented by a matrix, and it associates a pair of vectors to a scalar number that belongs to the field of construction. Now we can go one step further and take the example of the product of two matrices. So you have two matrices, A and B, okay, and you want, as a result of the map, the product of the two matrices. A matrix lives in a vector space. So if you have a matrix of size MP, it lives in a vector space of dimension MP, right? So this map can be represented as before by a tensor, that is, in that case, a trilinear map. And if this matrix, these matrices have these dimensions, so m by p, m by n, n by p, then you can represent this mapping by an array with three indices, and these indices range in 1 to mn, 1 to np, 1 to mp. So you have a kind of cube, okay? And you end up with an array that is mostly sparse, but it completely defines this map. A third example that is also very simple is the case of moments of random variables. So take three multivariate random variables, x, y, z, and assume that you want to compute the third order moment. If you change these random variables by applying three linear transformations, u, v, and w, how does it impact the third order moment? So we know that the result is the following. We know the relationship between t prime and t. This is multilinear with respect to the three input variables, which means that u, v, and w are involved in the formula this way. And I decide in this talk to use this compact notation, which allows me to avoid the use of indices, so it's more readable. Okay, there is a very special class of tensors which is quite interesting, namely decomposable tensors. They are sometimes referred to as simple tensors. And what are they? A simple tensor is the outer product of vectors. In other words, if you take the array that represents this tensor, dijk, it's just the product of the arrays representing the vectors. In other words, you can also see this array as the discretization of a function of many variables, but whose variables separate. So you take f of x, y, z. If you discretize this function on a regular grid, you obtain an array of this type. And if it is a function whose variables separate, you have this expression. Okay? So this is a possible interpretation. Now, there is a statement that has been noticed by Hitchcock in 1927, long ago, which is quite easy to prove. So if you are given a tensor, you can always decompose it into a sum of decomposable tensors, which means that you can write this in terms of arrays of coordinates as well. We shall see that in a moment. But what is very interesting is that this number r of terms that are requested to have an exact equality characterizes the tensor, and we call this quantity the tensor rank. So remember that matrices are tensors of order 2. So this should apply to matrices as well. And this definition is consistent with the matrix rank that we know. Okay? And with this definition, you can notice that D is a rank 1 tensor. So a rank R matrix, for instance, is the sum of R rank 1 matrices, right? So this is also true for tensors. That's the definition of tensor rank. Now, Frank Hitchcock is not very well known to us. I don't know if you ever heard about him. Before seeing this result, I didn't know him at all. But there is someone you definitely know, and it's one of his PhD students, Claude Shannon. So he made a PhD on theoretical genetics, something like that. Nothing to do with information theory. He worked on that much later on. Okay, that's fun. So now I would like to stress on another property. So I said that a decomposable tensor is defined as the outer product between vectors. Now, if you transform A into alpha A, B to beta B, C to gamma C, if the product of these scalar numbers is equal to 1, you end up with exactly the same tensor, right? So it means that there is not a one-to-one correspondence between the Cartesian product of between the spaces and the tensor space. Actually, you should view the tensor space spanned by decomposable tensors. Okay, you make a linear combination of decomposable tensors, you generate all possible tensors. So the tensor space is spanned by this kind of tensors. You have not a one-to-one correspondence because here you have just a Cartesian product between vector spaces, and on the other side you have something that is smaller. Actually, you have to take into account this equivalence relation. So it's a kind of quotient between this Cartesian product between spaces and this equivalence relation. So a tensor is actually an equivalence class, so to say, in short. Okay. Now, I would like still to go back to the matrix case so that we really understand what we are talking about. So if we are given a matrix of rank R, we know it's a sum of AR, BR transpose, okay, R terms. Okay. The question is, can we identify RR and BR? The answer is no, because when I say identify, I mean, is it unique? Of course, it's not unique. If you stack AR and BR in matrices, in columns, like this, so you have M equals AB transpose, right? But of course, you could insert Q inverse in between, and you have, in that case, two new matrices having different columns, so you have another expression with A prime R, B prime R, which are totally different, and they are not just a scaled version. So they are not deduced from AR and BR by just multiplying by a scalar factor. They are very different. And that's precisely the advantage in using tensors instead of matrices. So in the decomposition, you have a very important property, and this has been proved by Joseph Kruskal in 1977. It's the theorem that follows here. If the rank is not too large, so the bound has been accurately calculated, if the rank is not too large, this decomposition is unique up to scaling factors. So the indeterminacy is much smaller than in the matrix case. So you could say, well, if I have scaling factors, maybe I could fix them by some very simple constraints. So assume, for instance, that you decide that here my rank 1 tensor can be split into a term that has unit norm, and here I pull the norm outside. Okay, I can do that. So lambda r is a positive real number, and this is a unit norm tensor. I can do that. Now, if I, as before, if I decide to store AR, BR, and CR, these vectors, into matrices A, B, and C as columns, I end up with a relationship like this. You remember, this is the notation I have introduced at the beginning of the talk. So it means that if I have here a tensor, let's say an array with 3 indices that is diagonal, and I put the lambda r on the diagonal, then my tensor here is related to this one by this multilinear relation. Okay. If dr has unit norm, these matrices have unit norm columns. So do I fix all the indeterminacy this way? Almost, but not quite, because there is still some scaling indeterminacy with coefficients of unit modulus that remain, okay? But if I am in R+, I'm done. In R+, I have no indeterminacy left. So that's an interesting observation, because we have many data that are in R+, actually. But there are also many applications where just a scaling of unit modulus is not a big deal. So now let's again and again compare with matrices, because this is what we know the best, okay? What is the SVD of a matrix? So given a matrix M, if I use the notation I have proposed at the beginning of the talk, I'm just saying that from the diagonal matrix of singular values, I can deduce matrix M by this transformation where U and V are orthogonal matrices or unitary in the complex field. Okay? How can I generalize this to tensors? So we have just seen one possible generalization, which is what I call the canonical polyadic decomposition, which means that here I have a diagonal non-negative real tensor, and here 3 matrices. Now, I have a question. Take as a simple case where T is cubic, that is, T is n by n by n, same dimensions, okay? Just to have a discussion. So, this has n to the cube degrees of freedom. What happens on the right? If the rank is R, here, since it is diagonal, I have R degrees of freedom, okay? These 3 matrices are n by r, n by r, n by r. So I have 3 times n by r plus r. Here I have n cube. So you cannot impose r to be of order n. It's impossible. In general, r must be larger than n, right? Otherwise, you have not enough degrees of freedom. So this is what happens. So the rank, in general, is larger than dimensions. That's important. So if you impose diagonality of this tensor, then you must allow A, B, and C to have more columns than rows. So you cannot impose them to be orthogonal matrices. It's impossible. In general, they will be even rectangular. Well, there is another possible extension. If I still want to impose orthogonality, which has, in general, little meaning physically in practice, there are very few applications where this is meaningful. But if I still want to do that, then the tensor, the core tensor that appears here, cannot be diagonal. So it will have a dimension, let's say, R1 by R2 by R3. R1, R2, R3 corresponding to the number of columns of these 3 matrices. But it will be dense. It's not diagonal. And it turns out that this is also a known decomposition, and it characterizes the multilinear rank of T if R1, R2, and R3 are minimal. So you have 2 definitions of ranks if you want. And the 2 can be compared. So R is always at least as large as the max of those 3, and it is always smaller than the product 2 by 2 between these multilinear ranks. So what are the possible applications? Here it is unique if the rank is not too large, so it allows for parameter identification. Very useful in practice. And this one is imposing some arbitrary constraint of orthogonality. It lacks uniqueness, so it can be very useful for compression or denoising, but not for parameter identification. Okay. Now there are some difficulties that I guess I must skip, but here there's something important that I should mention. It's the fact that the set of tensors of rank at most R is not closed unless R equals 1. This means what? It means that you can have a sequence of tensors of rank R that converges to a larger rank. For instance, you sequence of tensors of order of rank 2 converging to a rank 7. This may happen. This is absolutely impossible for matrices. So the consequence is that if you wish to approximate a tensor sitting somewhere here by another of lower rank, it may not be well posed because the limit is not of the same rank. But that's bad news. But there is a good news. The good news is that if you are in R+, it is well posed. So that's a very good news. So we must be very careful if we deal with real or complex tensors, but if we are in R+, everything goes fine. Okay, now, second part of the talk, some applications. So the first, there are many applications that you can find in the literature. So Bayesian networks, mining databases, chemometrics, hyperspectral imaging, antenna array processing, telecommunications, biomedical, etc. When can we resort to tensor decompositions in applications? The condition is that we need to have an array with at least 3 indices. Otherwise, we have a matrix. Okay, so we need 3 indices. And we need these array of numbers to contain non-proportional slices. Otherwise, if you take a matrix and you say, I take twice that matrix as a second observation, it doesn't bring new information. So you need these matrix slices to be independent. Okay. So in practice, you have already at your disposal in many databases where you have discrete attributes, you already have this kind of data, so it's okay. But in many other cases, you don't. So I take an example where you have measurements as a function of space and time, and you have nothing else. Only 2 indices. So if you discretize space and time, you don't have a tensor. What can you do? Then, if you have data that are non-stationary, you can always generate a frequency dimension by taking a local Fourier transform, wavelets, or what you want. And it is not redundant. So, because the transformation is not linear. So you generate some information, you put it in the format of a tensor, and you can exploit tensor decompositions. You can do the same if you have measurements that are not homogeneous in space. You generate the wave vector dimension. And there are also other examples that I show in a minute about space translation, repetition of experiments that can bring you some additional diversity. Okay. So the first example I want to show you is topic modeling. So the basic block historically that has been introduced is this one, the PLSI model, where you have discrete variables, W1, W2, Wn, that are observed. They are called tokens, and they are correlated to each other, but they are assumed to be conditionally independent, conditionally to some hidden variable z, often referred to as topic. So this means that the joint probability of these Wi that are observed, if you use the Bayes rule, is expressed as the sum of this product of conditional probabilities. And what is this? This is exactly the CP decomposition. You remember? That's a tensor with indices I, J, K, L, and here you have this stands for your lambda I, and here you have the decomposable tensor. Okay, you recognize it? So then, of course, in the literature, this has been extended to several topics. So here I've put pictures of Michael Jordan from UC Berkeley, who has proposed this modeling with several topics. And this is Anima Anand Kumar from UC Irvine, and she's currently promoting the use of tensor decompositions for graphical models, topic modeling, community detection, and so forth. Another example is chemometrics. Do you show the paper? Okay, 10 minutes. Okay, good. An example in chemometrics, and more precisely 3D fluorescence spectroscopy. So here is a picture of Rasmus Bro. He's from Copenhagen Food Science Department. He has proposed something interesting. So you make measurements. So you have a solution containing toxic molecules, and they are fluorescent. Many toxic molecules are fluorescent, especially if they contain benzene. I shall show you some examples of such molecules. So you excite the solution with the light as a function of, this is the wavelength of the excitation light. And the solutions is emitting light in turn at a lower energy level, so at a larger wavelength. And this is the intensity. You have a matrix here. That's a matrix. It's not a tensor. But you can make several measurements. Assume that you want to monitor the tap water. So you can make one measurement in the morning, one at noon, one in the evening. You have 3 measurements. It is very unlikely that the relative concentrations are exactly the same morning, noon, and night, right? So you have slightly different concentrations. So this gives you a tensor with 3 matrix slices, and you can run you can compute the CP decomposition. And why is this working? Actually, you must get rid of some diffusion effects that are not really of interest for our purpose, but once you have done that, the Beer-Lambert law, characterizing modeling fluorescence, can be linearized and takes this expression. This is intensity as a function of the 2 wavelengths that we showed, that we have seen on the picture. And here I have put K. K is the number of the measurement. So 1 for the morning, 2 for noon, 3 for the night. And then you have this kind of expression. You have what they call the spectra, emission and fluorescence spectra. They are actually a function of the wavelengths. And here the relative concentrations of the hidden toxic molecules that are indexed by L. This is exactly, again, the CP decomposition we have already seen, right? Multivariate function that splits into a sum of functions whose variables separate. So given only the left-hand side, we can identify all terms in the right-hand side. That's really nice. And this gives, in our example, if I take one slice of the results, I can identify these spectra that are characteristic of toxic molecules. Here I have naphthalene, for instance, that you recognize. I mean, you have to look up after that in a dictionary to recognize what are the molecules involved. But what is important is that you don't need to have such a dictionary in advance to be able to separate the solutees. Okay. Now, another example is hyperspectral imaging. So hyperspectral camera records the electromagnetic radiations reflected by the surface of, let's say, a planet. And there are several materials that are present on the surface when they are illuminated by the ambient electromagnetic field. And this is recorded at many, many frequencies, hundreds and sometimes even thousands of frequencies. So here on the picture, they are stacked. All the frequencies are stacked here. And this is space. That is, here you have several pixels. Every pixel contains, a priori, several materials. We don't know in advance which ones. Okay. And the goal is first to unmix the contribution of each material, and hence to reach a sub-pixel resolution. And then, after that, identify what materials are in presence and what is their relative abundance. Well, again, we have the same problem as before, because this measurement is of matrix type. Why? Because space here cannot be considered, if I take this picture, I cannot consider that space is 2D, because here I want to find a low rank approximation. An image is not low rank. So space is only 1D. So I have one dimension here for frequency, one for space, and one is lacking. So what we have done is to take measurements at different times again. And the incidence light, or the incidence electromagnetic field, changes with time, so that materials do not reflect exactly the same way. So this gives me the third diversity. And again, I have a model that looks like CP decomposition. So given H, I can identify all the parameters on the right. Now, maybe the last example, because the time is fading away. And this is antenna array processing. Here in that case, I'm not working in R+, I work in the complex field. So things are slightly more complicated. I shall not go into the details because there are difficulties to overcome. Here I have an array of 12 sensors. But if I am smart enough to locate these sensors so that they can be seen as 3 sub-arrays here that are translated with respect to each other. You see there is no rotation between the red, the blue, and the green. They are just translated. Then I have a model that looks like the CP decomposition again, provided I am in the far field and in narrowband. So again, this is possible. I can locate radiating sources, detect how many there are, and so forth. So now my conclusion. Now it's your turn to think a little bit. This is a quiz, so you have to try to answer the questions. So can a tensor have a rank larger than dimensions? You remember? Yes. Good. Yes, it can. Okay, next. Is the CP decomposition unique? So, yes, if the rank is smaller than some bound. And, of course, the order must be larger than 2. Otherwise, you have a matrix. And for the matrix case, we know it's not the case. Okay. Now, if I draw randomly tensors, so this is a question that I have not addressed. So you cannot answer probably. But if you draw randomly the entries of a matrix, according to a continuous distribution, you know that the rank is maximal. You get a full rank matrix. For tensor, it's not true. So it's very hard to generate a tensor with maximal rank. We don't know how to do. But if you draw it randomly, you find a rank that is larger than the dimensions still, but it's not maximal. Okay. This you should be able to answer. If you are given a tensor, is it always possible to find its low rank approximation? So in general, no, but in R+, yes. Okay? Good, good. Hey, you have well understood. I'm proud. Okay. Now, this is something I have not said, but this is a question that you may have in mind. Since the rank 1 approximate to any tensor, it always exists, and the problem is well posed, you could think, well, I could proceed as a deflation, you know, find a best rank 1 approximation, I subtract it, and I go on, I continue. I estimate the new rank 1 approximation of the reduced tensor and so forth. This does not work because the rank does not decrease if you subtract the best rank 1 approximation. Okay, thank you.